How's it going, YouTube? Coming in today with another video, and today, guys, the brand new is going to be the meta breakdown. So I do hope that you enjoy today's video because there's going to be a lot to talk about. Today we're going to be focusing on aspects of the meta, including what are the best decks, what are the best sleeper decks, the best side cards, tech cards, hand traps, and much more. So if you haven't already checked out my sponsors over at Imperium Duelist or Dragon Shield or Gem, definitely go ahead and do so. All down in the description below. And without further ado, let's hop right into our first topic. So the first thing I want to cover is going to be the meta in general. This is really important when it comes down to what deck you want to play for the format, and these are the things that I really like to consider. The first thing is going to be that there's a lot of main deck blowouts right now, including Dust or evenly Lightning Storm. Some people are on Dark Ruler. I'm seeing a lot of Droplet in the sideboard, but for the most part, evenly and Lightning Storm are really popular at the moment. So this is really going to be what deck you want to play right now. If you want to play like a back row deck, you have to have something to counter these situations. If you're playing a combo deck, you have to either put up a massive board that can go ahead and negate all of these, or put up a minimal board and have hand and grave interruptions so you can at least not die that turn and have follow-up for the next turn. So that's something really important to note. Tons of hand traps, and I mean a bunch of hand traps are in the format right now. So this is something else. Ash is kind of a god card right now. Just the fact that you can Ash so many different decks, and it's really impactful, including decks like Branded. We see a lot of Nibiru, a lot of Imperm, and we're starting to see a resurgence in Bell. So definitely something that you want to keep in mind whenever you're trying to, again, pick the deck that you want for the format. I feel like Ash versus Branded or even Labyrinth is really crazy. So that's why a lot of people, I feel like, are switching to things like Trap Tricks, because at that point you can have a lot more plays through a lot of those situations. Also, having cards like Rafflesia mean that you don't lose auto to like Lightning Storm, because even if you have one or two sets, it doesn't really matter too much because then you have Rafflesia. So definitely a lot of interesting boards that we're seeing put up now with a lot of the different decks that we have. We're definitely back to a tier 2 format, so not a lot of the decks are able to do a whole lot once their board gets broke, and that's why we're seeing a lot more simplified game states. And that's pretty crazy too, because now your follow-up is like fine, but it's not game breaking. So it's really crazy if you play a deck like Sword Soul and then your initial like Blackout Baron Chi gets broken. You really need to be able to have things like Vashuda and Taya to really be able to follow up with. And again, follow up now just doesn't really feel the same as last format. So definitely want to pick a deck that you can either find a lot of follow up with, or again, just one of those decks you just put up like 4 or 5 negations and hope that your opponent can't break it. And then last but not least, there's a lot of back row decks that we're seeing right now. I've heard talks of people playing Guru, we have Labyrinth, we have Trap Tricks. So definitely a lot of those back in the meta now as well. We're going to be talking about a lot of really cool options that you can play right now, including Live Twin. I think this deck is actually really solid, a lot of room for utility. You can also play the Sprite cards, which means that you can play rank 2s like Mosquito, so that's just auto win right there. That card's insane going second. You have cards like a Mannequin Cat. Then you also just have the Live Twin engine too. So I think that this has a lot of promise, this format, and it's definitely going to be very good. The really cool thing about all the decks that you see here besides Labyrinth is most of them are just $30 for the entire core, which is pretty crazy. So definitely go ahead and pick up 1 or even 2 of these just so you have different decks that you can play. But this is definitely a very cheap format to play in, and any one of these decks can do extremely well. Even the Trap Tricks deck right now is 3 structure decks, so definitely pretty insane. 2 decks that I really like on here right now are Marincess and Adagnister, usually with the Mathmech cards. I think that Adagnister is really cool because you can get Nibiru and still put up a 6k arrival. And then Marincess, the amount of follow-up that this deck has is actually just insane. You have cards like Anemone that when they go to the grave, you can go ahead and add 1 back. You have cards like Marble Rock that allow you to add back. You have cards like Blue Tang that will mill and then add you a card. There are just so many situations where you're going to have follow-up, including Coral Triangle. That card's actually just absurd. But so this deck is really nice too because you can run like 18 utility cards, and that's unheard of in most decks, especially if you're just doing a 1-card combo that just gets you everything that you need, and especially if you can set it up again. And then you have cards like World Sea Dragon that can go ahead and clear a board. So definitely a lot of promise in playing decks like Marincess. Again, it's like 30 if that for the entire core, so definitely recommend going ahead and picking that up. Trap Tricks, again, just a really solid deck. Dino is something that a lot of people don't expect right now. There's so many different ways that you can actually get to Miscellaneousaurus, and then also with the new support, you can loop Miscellaneousaurus, so that's pretty crazy too. This card's insane. Definitely something to consider, because in the simplified game states that we're seeing, cards like Ultimate Conductor go kind of crazy. So this is another deck that you can consider. Lost World against Kashtira, that's just an auto win. You give them a token. Nothing can even be targeted. Against Labyrinth, again, nothing can be targeted. So definitely a really cool option for the format. Labyrinth, I really don't even think that this is the craziest back row deck that we have. I think that Trap Tricks is honestly a little bit better. But I do think that Labyrinth has a lot of promises format too. Being able to set cards like D-Barrier and Eradicator, of course, are going to do you very well in a tournament. Having the Floodgates that you can get to very easily as well. Definitely a deck that you have to look out for. Virtual World's another deck though that I think is really crazy right now. Cards like Chuche that allow you to just go ahead and clear as much as possible. And this is the deck that, yeah, it can break, but at the same time you have cards like Shen Shen and even Fan Fan in the extra deck. That card's insane. And so I do think that this deck has a lot of promise moving forward, and this is something that maybe you consider picking up. And especially like the adventure variant of Virtual World, very, very solid. The next one, and this is one that I really want to talk about, and that's going to be Eldritch. And I think that this is the best back row deck that we have right now, to be honest. I think that it's insane that you just have the availability to go ahead and get all of your cards back if you get Lightning Stormed anyway. And cards like Skill Drain in this format are just going to be insane. So having a 3500 can't be killed by card effects monster on your board under Skill Drain is pretty hard to out most times. So I do think that Eldritch has a lot of promises for it too. Cards like Golden Land Forever, again, just having a in-archetypal counter traps is really insane. There's so many different ways you can play Eldritch as well, especially if you're going to play like Cyrus Eldritch. I think that this deck has a lot of potential in this format and something that is really going to be prominent once we start seeing the format shape up. The next thing I want to talk about is going to be some of the best side cards that we see right now. The one that I did not include is Unending Nightmare. I think that card's insane. You can keep popping the fountain until they can't protect it anymore. You can keep popping floodgates. Unending Nightmare is just one of those utility cards that I think is really underused, and that card's really insane. I think that my favorite side card this format, the absolute most goated side card that you can be running, is Lancia. This card's insane. You drop it in draw phase usually, so you play around cards like Pot of Prosperity. This card's really nuts too against Runic. It's really good against Kashtira. It's good against Flu. It just has so many applications in this format that you need 3 Lancia in your sideboard right now. This card is going to win you games just because you drop it. Like, that's insane. This card is so very good. If you play even against like the Dragon Bestial deck, this card's also very good in that situation. The next one that's really underused as well is Droplet. Now, I know that Kashtira is a deck, and we do see Droplet in some people's sideboards, but I do think that Droplet's still one of the best, if not the best card in the game right now. This card's absolutely insane, being able to out a lot of very problematic situations, even if you're playing against Labyrinth, and then they have Lady Labyrinth and can be killed or targeted by card effects, you can always just go ahead and Droplet so you can deal with it. So that's another thing, if you're playing like Striker, being able to just go, okay, Droplet, negate that, use Burner, pop that in a back row, that's pretty insane too. Of course, if they have like big Welcome Labyrinth, they can just like put it back to hand, but still something to consider. I think that cards like Droplet, again, are just very underused and very strong in this format. The same as Dark Ruler, though. If you're playing against Sprite, it's insane. If you're playing against Kashtira, it still does enough. If you're able to negate the Arise Heart, which is really solid too, of course, unless they have things like Lance, which is like, it is what it is. But Dark Ruler, it still does enough this format that I think that it's warranted to play, and that's why cards like Anti-Spell are really insane as well, because if you're able to flip this in the draw phase, of course, then it just forces your opponent to just activate as many cards as possible, especially if they're on things like Runic, if they want to go ahead and even attempt to play the game. If they're playing Striker, usually quick play back removal isn't a thing right now unless you're siding. That's going to be cards like Cosmic that we do side, and that's another reason why Lance is really good for cards like Cosmic and Evenly. If you're just trying to go like the post siding in to counter your opponent's side, that's also really solid. But Anti-Spell in general, I think, is just really crazy. It works really well against all the tactics right now in the format. It's really solid against a lot of the spell decks, especially if you're versing like Branded. This card is just an FDK, so definitely something to consider. The other card beside Lancia that I think should be in your sideboard right now is DD Crow. I think this card's really insane. If you play against Math Mech, again, you can go ahead and snipe the diameter out of your opponent's graveyard. Play against Branded, you can go ahead and hit every target out of your opponent's graveyard, whether or not it's a Bestial target, the Albion that's attempting to go off in end phase, the Branded and Red target, the Branded Banishment target. I know that a lot of people are off Branded Banishment right now, but Branded and Red is still very real. There's a lot of situations, even against like Trap Tricks, where DD Crow is really solid too. So something to really consider. Lancia and DD Crow, both very popular options right now and both very solid. The last two here, one being Lance, I don't really have to explain this. There's a lot of back row decks out there right now. It's really solid to protect your monster. And then D-Barrier, the card that just should be banned, that's not banned somehow. This card's insane. This is something that you flip up and you win the game against a lot of matchups, which is pretty crazy. And there's not much counterplay outside of the Crossout Designator because they took away Red Reboot. which I still think Red Reboot should be a 3 for cards like this, but that's just how it is, I guess. Cards like Erad, cards like D-Barrier, there's not a whole lot of counterplay to, and those cards are just inherently crazy. I definitely want to see something about that change in the future, just because those cards are very lopsided. So I want to talk about the best hand trap lineup right now, and I think that's going to be Ash, Nibiru, Imperm, and Ghost Bell. I think that objectively, Ash and Bell do the same thing in a lot of situations. If you're playing against Branded, if your opponent goes Albion, dump Branded Fusion, and then the Saronir dump the Retribution to add back Branded Fusion, you can go ahead and Bell. So essentially you can say like you belled your opponent's Branded Fusion, right? Then if they have Branded Fusion, of course you can just Ash it. It's the same thing as if your opponent's on like Naughty or Servant, you can Ash or Bell. There's a lot of situations where both of the cards do almost the same thing and they're both very impactful. If you're playing against Runic, you can hit the Fountain with either. So I definitely recommend playing both. I usually play like 3 Ash and 2 Bell. Usually don't want to max out on Bell because I don't want to brick on cards that just aren't multiple per turn. But at the same time, Ash you just really want to see, and if you see Ash and Bell, usually just win the game. Even if you're playing against like Eldritch, we already know that seeing both of these cards is really insane, especially against cards like Sanguine. Nibiru and Imperm, these cards are just crazy together, but also Nibiru and Imperm individually are just really crazy cards into most formats, especially this one, where a lot of the boards just aren't really insane, and then there's a lot of decks that can't really play around Nibiru, so definitely recommend going ahead and playing this really crazy card still, and definitely something that I would be including in my main deck. The 2 cards that I feel like are really underused right now are Droll and Gamma. Now, I feel like Gamma's a lot better than Droll at the moment, but Droll into a lot of the decks that, again, are more tier 2 right now is really insane because if you think about it, if a deck needs 3 searches to be able to have, like, a full functional turn, right? And then you Droll after the first one. If the deck's already not super crazy and they only got 1 search, a lot of times their end board's gonna be super suboptimal. If you go ahead and use Droll against a deck like that, I think that it's really good though, because at that point you can go for lethal in the follow-up turn. And so it might not be the craziest card, but it's definitely something that can make sure that your opponent does not have a really crazy turn. But the next card here being Gamma, there's a lot of decks that really need their first card to go off. If you're playing against like Sword Soul, they go Moe, Reveal, and then you Gamma, that's pretty insane. If you're playing against like Marincess and they go normal summon like the Seahorse into the Sea Angel and you Gamma, that's really insane. There's a lot of situations where Gamma will just outright win you the game, and I think that this is a card that not a lot of people have been playing, but you definitely want to consider siding this because this is definitely a blowout. Especially if you're playing against even like Sprite and they go normal Beaver and they go Effect and you Gamma and they don't have starter, that is a pass turn. So definitely really crazy and something that you should be on the lookout for. The next card that I want to talk about is going to be Called by the Grave. I think this card is just insane now more than ever. Just being able to use this card again because there's no Keldo or Mudora in the graveyard. But this card alone, just being able to hit things like Golden Lords out of the grave, the branded targets, you can go ahead and hit things like the Diameter. You can hit so many different things in the graveyard right now that is just really crazy. And again, if your opponent already has like a Nibiru in the graveyard and you're worried about Nibiru and they reveal it in hand, you can go ahead and call by the Nibiru out of the graveyard. Like the endless utility out of this card is just so very strong, especially if you're worried about cards like Ash Blossom, again, because some decks really do care. This is a card that you really want to be running, and it's very good offensively as it is defensively. If you're playing against Dragon, you can go ahead and hit the Seal out of the graveyard, and that's really crazy. So definitely should be running the one of Call by the Grave right now. I think that it gets a lot better this format. The best floodgate in the game that we have right now is There Can Be Only One. If you can run this card, I definitely recommend it. This card's absolutely insane. Play against Flandres, play against the Sword Soul deck, play against Kashtira. There's just so many different decks where this card really does a lot of work. So I definitely recommend going ahead and running this. The card's really crazy. So if you do have room and if your deck can play it, you probably should be. The next thing I want to talk about is going to be Ancient Fairy Dragons coming out here in a couple days in the Maze of Memories. This card is going to get banned again. It just will. Definitely expect to see a lot of decks that are mixing up with things like Kashtira, because you can go ahead and open up with your Kashtira plays, make Ancient Fairy, blow up the Kashtira field spell, and add something different. So this card is definitely going to be really insane and something that you want to look out for. This card got errated, but it really didn't get errated, you know? So we'll definitely see what this card does, but just know that this card's probably going to get banned again in the near future. So I hope that everyone enjoys today's video. If you haven't already checked my Discord, Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, definitely go ahead and do so. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, we're on our way to 20,000 subs. I'm very excited. That's my goal for the end of the year. So let's try and hit that as quick as we can. Huge giveaways are going to come with that and a huge celebration as well. If you haven't already checked out my Metafy page, definitely go ahead and do so. And if you have any questions, feel free to PM me on Discord. I hope that everyone has a wonderful night, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you.